So after the death of Phinehas and Hophni and their father Eli, the story continues on in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, beginning in verse 19. Here's what it says. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant. She was about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she didn't answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and her father-in-law and her husband had been killed." Again, she concluded, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Ebenezer, Ichabod. Two different symbolic words in this passage. Ebenezer, God is with us. Ichabod, God has left us. The glory has departed. There's sometimes not that much difference between Ebenezer and Ichabod. Sometimes superstition and faith look very similar. So I want to make three observations. I hope you can apply these in your own life. I hope we can apply these in the church here at Kiskeya. Three things that make the difference between Ichabod and Ebenezer. Number one, you can see in this passage one of the issues was there was no integrity in leadership. That's the first thing that makes God's glory depart, when the leaders no longer keep their integrity. Eli, who had lived in integrity and followed the Lord and had tried to lead Israel as a spiritual leader, Eli made this bizarre choice. I don't know why, but he chose not to discipline his sons. And so Hophni and Phinehas, who are going to be the next one of them, the next high priest, were unusually corrupt. That's what the Bible tells us. They were taking money out of the collection plate. They were stealing from the temple. They were having adulterous relationships with females. They were living completely out of control. Now, when that happens, when the leadership of the church loses its integrity, I'm not saying loses its perfection, but its integrity, that's a different thing. And God's glory will depart when the leaders lack integrity. This has certainly been true in the United States. All of a sudden, we find that divorce statistics among pastors in America are slightly higher than they are in the general culture. And you go, okay, it's not perfection. Sometimes things happen. But when the leaders lack integrity, it makes it difficult for them to preach effectively. Same's true in their finances. Oftentimes, church leaders in America are in worse financial situations than the people they're trying to lead. I know this is true in Haiti. I hear it. I hear Haitian pastors that will tell me that the level of corruption in the church in Haiti among the leaders is beyond comprehension. They'll say so many pastors use it as a way to get people's money, to get rich. Just the opposite of what we see in the Old and the New Testament. Godly leaders often lead in sacrifice. They don't live separate lifestyles than the people. They live godly lifestyles. They set a model and an example. And when that ceases to happen, you've lost something. I have a friend that we've met, a Haitian pastor up in the mountains, and he's always saying to me, very cynical about it, he'll say, oh yeah, if a Haitian pastor opens a school or an orphanage, you know they're using it as a fundraiser to get money. That's the sure sign of corruption. Now, I don't believe that totally. I know there are leaders of integrity out there who are starting schools or orphanages or other ministries, not for their personal gain, but to advance the kingdom of God. But if he's right, and the leadership among Haitian churches is lacking integrity, the glory of God will depart. By the way, this is why things like Wawa's Step Seminary are so important, that they begin to teach integrity and accountability among Haitian pastors. It cannot be a means for financial gain, Paul says. The last thing that should happen among pastors is that they become part of the bourgeois elite. There has to be integrity in leadership. And so I ask the question, in Haiti, do we see integrity amongst leaders? If not, we must discipline this. We must begin to confront this issue, or the glory of God will depart and we will be Ichabod. So that's number one, integrity in leadership. Number two thing I noticed in this passage is the people had become self-reliant. Now, I know they trotted out the ark and they said religious prayers and they did all kinds of things when they were in trouble, but their day-to-day lives, they relied on themselves. And when that happens, you move from Ebenezer to Ichabod. It's really common. It's certainly common in the United States, where people rely on their houses, they rely on all their stuff, they rely on counselors and doctors and science and college and all these things. And Jesus is just kind of a backup plan for them in case they get in really big trouble. Israel became that way. They became dependent upon their horses and their chariots and their organizations and their military army, and less dependent upon God. They became more self-sufficient. I've quoted this before, but the African-American author Alex Haley, who wrote the famous book Roots, used to have a saying. I love this saying, so I never tire of repeating it. If you see a turtle on a fence post, you can be assured it didn't get there on its own. See, turtles can't climb a fence post. And the same thing is true of human beings. If you see a people who are being blessed by God, a sense of Ebenezer, they didn't get there on their own. It came from relying on God. Israel didn't get to become a great nation here in Samuel's days because of their self-reliance. They got there because men of God, leaders of integrity, led them to rely on God first. Or as Jesus puts it in Matthew 6:33, they began to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. You see, you can't, as Jesus said, serve two masters. You can't have reliance on your finances or your education and rely on God. Doesn't mean you can't be educated or even wealthy. It just means that your reliance must be clear. You must see these as the gifts and blessings of God. So I ask you this morning, Ebenezer or Ichabod? If I examined your life, would I find that you really rely on your own resources? Or would I find you relying on God? You seek him first. Okay, so that's number two. Number one, leaders without integrity. Number two, the people become self-reliant. They become like turtles on a fence post. Number three thing, and I've already talked a bit about this, but it's the most important part of this. Number three, they began swapping out true faith for superstition. And we're all prone to this. We think we can drag the ark out and it'll just solve everything. We think we can say a certain prayer or go to church or give some money or do whatever. We think it will change God's presence in our life and we'll start winning. But God will not be anybody's lucky charm. He will not be yours. He will not be Israel's. You can't trot him out and say, now do what I want you to do. He's not like a genie that pops out of the bottle and gives us our wishes. In fact, quite the opposite. As Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus sought first the kingdom. He wanted to know, God, I want to put faith in your plan. I don't want to superstitiously use you to bless my plan. And so again, I ask you this morning, are you more invested in superstition or in faith? Do you trot God out when you get in trouble, when you need help on something, and then ignore him the rest of the time? Or is God the anchor that you put faith in on a daily basis? If you're a superstitious Christian, then you learn the lingo and you occasionally go to church and you give a little bit of money and you ask God, why aren't I winning? Why doesn't everything I do get blessed? But God will not bless superstition. He will only give his presence to true faith. To true faith. So which is it for you? Ebenezer or Ichabod?